The IEP, or an Individualized Education Program, is a written document developed for every child who attends a public school and who is eligible for special education. Clearly, the IEP is a very important document for children with disabilities and for those who are involved in educating them. When done correctly, the IEP should improve teaching, learning, and results. Each child's IEP describes the educational program that has been designed to meet that child's unique needs. Please make sure you did the reading before proceeding with this video. This brief overview is meant to be a reminder of the key points from your readings. If you only watch this video, you will be missing some of the necessary information to understand this whole process. By law, certain individuals must be involved in writing a child's individualized education program. These people must work together as a team to write the child's IEP. Each team member brings important information to the IEP meeting. Members share their information and work together to write the child's IEP. Each person's information adds to the team's understanding of the child and what services the child needs. By law, the IEP must include certain information about the child and the educational program designed to meet his or her unique needs. In a nutshell, this information includes the student's current level of performance, annual goals and how progress will be measured, special education and related services, participation with non-disabled children, participation in state and district-wide tests, the environment where services will be provided, how to include a child in the regular education environment to provide access to general education curriculum, and needed transition services. Here are the main components of an IEP. You've already read about each of these, but I would like to recap with some additional information. We now use the acronym PLAF to describe a student's present levels of performance. This stands for present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. Functional performance refers to behavioral, social, and physical performance. The key with PLAF is that you must support these descriptions with data. You cannot just say, the student is good at math and struggles with reading comprehension. What data do you have to support this? Your perception does not count as data evidence. However, if you take anecdotal observation notes, that written evidence could count as a data source. This is where the team describes both strengths and needs of the students across these areas, supported by the results of the evaluations conducted for an initial referral or from progress monitoring of goals from the previous year. Annual goals are the goals that the child can reasonably accomplish in 1 year. The goals are broken down into short-term objectives or benchmarks for the more severe disabilities. Goals may be academic, address social or behavioral needs, relate to physical needs, or address other educational needs. The goals are to be written in an observable and measurable way, meaning that it must be possible to measure whether the student has achieved the goal. So data needs to be collected and be objective so that the teacher can show the student is making progress. You'll learn how to write these as you move on in your education program. But do remember, goals have to be crystal clear. The IEP must specify how the child's progress will be measured and how parents will be informed of that progress. You have to state exactly how educators are going to keep track of the child's growth. Are they going to collect data every week? Are they going to do it once a month? What data will be collected? What observations will be made? What measurements will be undertaken to see how a student is progressing toward their goals? It's very important that we are as precise as possible about these efforts so that we can really monitor a student. In order to benefit from special education, a child may require any of the following related services. Related services, as listed under IDEA, include the different areas listed on this slide. Related services are supportive services which are required to assist a child to benefit from special education. Such services include speech pathology and audiology, psychological services, physical and occupational therapy, counseling services, and all the other services you see on this list. The term related services also includes transportation and school health services. It also includes social work services and parent counseling and training. You see a list of related services on this slide, but this list is definitely not exhaustive. What related service a child needs is decided by the IEP team and is based on that child's needs. Not every child will need speech services, for instance, but some will. The IEP must state when services will begin, how often they'll be provided, where they'll be provided, and how long they will last. So how many hours a week of special education services will a child receive? How many hours a week of therapy will a child receive? In addition, the child's placement, where that IEP will actually be carried out, must be decided. Placement decisions must be made according to IDEA's least restrictive environment requirements, commonly known as LRE. These requirements state that, to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities must be educated with children who do not have disabilities. With that said, the IEP must explain the extent, if any, to which the child will not participate with non-disabled children in the general education and other school activities. Please note that this is very different than describing the extent to which the child will participate in the gen ed environment. With LRE, it is assumed students will participate with their peers unless reasonable and appropriate accommodations cannot be made in that setting. Sometimes students are pulled out for remedial intensive services that are more direct and in smaller groups than can be provided in the general education environment and without impacting the education of the other students. This is a good reason to have non-participation for that time period. By assuming the student will participate most of the time with their non-disabled peers, what we see is more of evidence-based instruction being used for all students in the classroom. Many times, the strategies we use for students with disabilities can be helpful to other students as well, particularly when supports are offered at differentiated levels. Most states and districts give achievement tests to children in certain grades or age groups. The IEP must state what modifications and accommodations in the administration of these tests the child will need. If a test is not appropriate for the child, the IEP must state why the test is not appropriate and how the child will be tested instead. These accommodations are designed to provide access to the test, not an unfair advantage. A student with a visual impairment, for example, may need tests in an alternative format. If a student with a math learning disability has difficulty with his or her working memory, this means holding information in your attention and then applying it to something else, he or she may be allowed to use a calculator for word problems or any math questions not seeking to evaluate the student's knowledge of basic math facts. The IEP also needs to specify what accommodations will be needed by the child in the general education classroom. Accommodations in the classroom and testing accommodations should generally match. The exception would be when a specific accommodation interferes with what the test is seeking to evaluate. For example, an in-class accommodation might be to read directions and questions aloud to the child so that maybe his or her reading disability doesn't interfere with the student being able to think critically about text and participate in class discussions. However, on a test that measures reading comprehension specifically, this type of accommodation would not be appropriate. If the child is 16 or older, there needs to be a statement of transition planning. In Illinois, we start this when the child is age 14 and a half, or younger if appropriate. The IEP team needs to start planning for this child's school to adult life transition. What goals does the student have after school that schools can work on with him or her? And what support system is it anticipated that the student will need after graduation from school? It's very important to understand that each child's IEP is different. The document is prepared for one child, one specific student. It describes the individualized education program and supports designed to meet that learner's needs. This is a reminder of the IEP process you read about. The first step of the special education process is the referral and evaluation. Remember, there may be a pre-referral process like RTI, which is part of the general education program, to see if improving instruction is sufficient to meet the student's needs. We'll talk more about this in the upcoming RTI video. Parent permission is required before an official evaluation can begin. Once a family signs the referral and gives permission for the evaluation to take place, the school has 45 days to complete the evaluation. If the results of the evaluation find the student eligible for special ed services under IDEA, an IEP meeting must be scheduled. It must occur within 30 days after the child is found eligible. At the initial meeting, the IEP is then written collaboratively. Once the IEP is written, it's time to carry it out. In other words, to provide the student with the special ed and related services as listed in the IEP. This includes all supplementary aids and services and program modifications that the IEP team has identified as necessary for the student to make progress toward his or her IEP goals. Every year, the IEP needs to be reviewed at what we call an annual review meeting. At this time, the team may make some changes to the program based on the student's progress toward his or her goals. IEP reevaluations are done every 3 years to determine if the student is still eligible to receive special ed services under IDEA. If the parents do not agree with any part of the IEP and placement, they may discuss their concerns with other members of the IEP team and try to work out an agreement. If they still disagree, parents can ask for mediation, or the school may offer mediation. Parents may file a complaint with the state education agency and may request a due process hearing, at which time mediation must be available. Federal law requires the child to be invited to an IEP meeting when transition planning is to be discussed. It does not require the student to actually attend the IEP meeting, though. If the child chooses not to attend, then the school must provide written proof of that invitation. Regardless of attendance, you should always try to capture the student's voice in the IEP process. What are some ways you could do this? You should have read an article by Cheatham and colleagues that described some mistakes people make in the IEP meeting. Let's see if you can recall what some of these errors were. Try not to go back to the article if you don't need to. Read this first scenario. What do you think the mistake was at this meeting, and what should the team have done? We call this one the time saver. IEP goals need to be individualized to students. You should never pick from a list of prescribed goals, even if you're running out of time at a meeting. They need to be decided collaboratively based on the student's needs. In this case, the parents may have felt bullied into using those goals. They were definitely not included as part of the team for that decision. Read the second scenario. What do you think the mistake was at this meeting, and what should the team have done? We call this the LRE plea. Remember, students should be educated with their non-disabled peers to the greatest extent appropriate where meaningful learning can occur. You don't see how they do in a more restrictive setting. You only move them to a more restrictive setting if there's evidence to support that their needs cannot be met in a less restrictive setting. In this case, the parents were once again not included as part of that decision-making process, and their concerns were not considered. Here's the next one. What's the mistake, and what should they have done? This is what we call the who's in charge. The team must have an administrator present. The meeting shouldn't have taken place if no decision could officially be made because the whole team wasn't there. Also, recommended services are not to be given based on the logistical availability or budget as approved by the administrator. They are based on the student need, and they are decided by the team. Here's the next one. I find this scenario particularly disturbing. There's no way every possible support option has been exhausted. We may need to keep better data, look at the instructional environment, look at the types of programs and instruction being used, and most importantly, whether that instruction has been given with fidelity. Whenever I hear someone tell me something isn't working, the first thing I want to see is their data that shows that, and to observe them to see if the supports were given in the way they were intended to be given. We call this one the search ain't over until it's over scenario. Here's scenario 5. They called this one the pass the buck, but I might also call it the blame game. The blame game is highly unproductive and it happens way too much. Putting Nick in another placement is also not the solution to help motivate him. This is a big red flag for us to look at our instruction. Why isn't he motivated? And how can you make math more relevant to him? Here's the last scenario. Every student with a disability is unique. Again, the team is not allowed to follow the old standby and assume this boy needs to go to a special school just because he has a visual impairment. They might need a specialist or a consultant to come in and help the teachers make appropriate accommodations for him, but if accommodations can be made in the general education environment to provide him access to the curriculum, then that is where he should be.